My name is Michael Oslin. I'm the Williams Rivers Fellow in Contemporary Asia here in the Washington office of the Hoover Institution. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here for a discussion on probably one of the top 2 to 3 foreign policy issues of the day, which is what's going on in China. What do we need to know? And what should we be doing about it? And to talk about that this morning and to celebrate the publication of the 3rd edition of their new book, it is a great pleasure to welcome Maura Cunningham and Jeff Wasserstrom here to Hoover. And I think if you don't have copies of the book, they are outside. So please grab a copy on your way out. This is, as you know, the 3rd edition of China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. When did the first edition come out?
2010.
2010, and then an edition in 2013, and now half a decade later, the 3rd edition. Let me just briefly introduce Maura and Jeff, and then we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves for a little while, and then we're going to open it up for a discussion with you as well, and we'll finish up right around 11:45 this morning. Maura Cunningham has her PhD from UC Irvine and a master's degree from Yale. She is a writer and historian of modern China. She was the editor-in-chief of the China Beat, which was a China-based blog at UC Irvine, and associate editor of China File, which is published by the Asia Society, and now works for the Association for Asian Studies, which is the big professional association related to educational, academic Asian studies, as their digital media manager. Jeff Wasserstrom, I think probably many of you know Jeff, is the Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine. He edits the Journal of Asian Studies. He has been a long-time scholar and publisher on various elements of China, Chinese history. He is the author of 8 Juxtapositions, China Through Imperfect Analogies, from Mark Twain to Manchukuo, and also edited the edited volume, the Oxford Illustrated History of Modern China. Jeff as well, as you know, and also Maura, write publicly about China, not just for the academic venues, but also in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, LA Review of Books, Times Literary Supplement, and the like. So among the few China scholars who are really trying to reach out and talk with a broader audience about China, which is actually what this book is all about. This is obviously not an academic book, so to speak, though it draws on deep academic knowledge, but it's a handbook. I've found it invaluable in trying to follow and understand what's going on with China, and that invaluable element of it seems to grow every single year as we get closer and closer to having a China that finally reaches the levels that we've been predicting for decades, a China that is central to almost all elements of U.S. policymaking, be it economic, be it strategic, be it political, be it cultural, and the like. And even if you're a skeptic of China, of which there are many, and certainly I've been skeptical of China, it is undeniable that China's growing influence in the world is something that's going to continue for the rest of all our working lives. And so how we think about China, what we need to know about China, is becoming increasingly important. So we're really thrilled to have this discussion here today. We're not going to go through the book, because if you look at it, it's really a whole series of elements that you just need to understand, of everything from Confucianism, what is Confucianism, to how is the Chinese economy run, and everything in between. But we're going to have just a broader discussion starting off today. And I really wanted to kick it off with probably the question that is on everyone's mind, which is, whither Xi Jinping? It's not a question we've actually had to ask in China for over a generation, really since Mao Zedong died, to link the fortunes of China, the future of China, with one individual. So the first question I would have, and I'll just pose it to Jeff to kick off, is, are we back there? Do we have to think about the fortune and the future of China related to one individual, namely Xi Jinping?
Well, I think so it's great to be here, and I think beginning with, I was going to say the elephant in the room, but the dragon in the room, for lack of a better way to think about it. Xi Jinping I think one of the first things to think as a historian always wants to go backward, but not going backward to Mao right now, but just 5 years ago, and how differently the discussion about Xi Jinping was then. The discussion then was basically, was Xi Jinping going to be another colorless, stay the course kind of leader like Hu Jintao, his predecessor, who had moved away from reform, reforms had stalled, or would he be a reformer, more in the mode of Deng Xiaoping? Would he restart the move toward experiments with greater openness, which is how Deng Xiaoping's remembered, even though Deng Xiaoping, of course, was also somebody who was very hard on issues of dissent at times like the Beijing massacre of 1989. But still, there was this idea that the two likely scenarios would be more of the same or a kind of hoped for restarting of liberalization. And what we got instead was a ratcheting up of the moves that had begun very slowly but now picked up speed toward tightening control. So I think we're at a very different period now. So we should remember, and this is something I think China specialists should always be upfront about, is how limited the predictive powers in the past have been. So that was the wrong way to frame the debate, we now know, 5 years ago, because Xi Jinping was neither of those things. So he has been, in many ways, it's a return to things we haven't seen since Mao. There's more of a personality cult. When you went to China under Hu Jintao's time, and Maura lived there more of that period than I did, significantly. I just visited. But when I visited China during the time of Hu Jintao, you could go a day very easily not being aware of who was in charge in China. You could go into a bookstore and you wouldn't see his face on any covers of any books. You could walk down a street and not see his picture on billboards. Now, and you couldn't, under Mao's time, you couldn't be unaware. I didn't go there under Mao, but you can tell from photographs from then Mao was everywhere. Under Deng Xiaoping, he was a strong leader, but you didn't see his face everywhere. When I did go to China first, lived there in the 80s, you knew who was in power, but you could forget it. Now at this point, you cannot forget that Xi Jinping is the central power holder. When you're on a subway, his face will show up on the television screen. When you go into a bookstore, his book is everywhere. Leaders with Deng, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, it wasn't until after they'd stepped down that their books of collected speeches came out. Xi Jinping's started coming out very, very soon. So we are back in a familiar pattern in that sense, and things that we didn't think, we thought China was not that kind of place anymore. We thought that the Communist Party, while there were continuities in it, we thought one of the things that had broken away from was this kind of personalistic power. So there are problems and limits with the Mao analogy, but I think the fact that we're thinking about it shows that things have changed.
So Maura, since you lived there under Hu Jintao's period, during Hu Jintao's period, how much of a break is this really? Is the era of collective leadership over? If so, what does that mean? And when does a cult of personality become a cult of personality, right? You've got Xi Jinping thought in the Constitution. You pick up Chinese papers and it's every headline, every front page, every picture is Xi Jinping. Are we at a cult of personality? So give us the sort of comparative from when you were there under Hu, and then bring us forward, if you can, into, is this really, have we broken from the past 40 plus years?
Right. So certainly, I think, as Jeff said, when I was living in China, which I went there for the first time in 2005 and studied Chinese in Beijing for 6 months, and then 2006 to 2008, I went back and I was living and studying at the Johns Hopkins Nanjing University program that's based there. And at that time, the Chinese government just seemed so far away that it wasn't really an issue who was in charge, or that who was in charge. it was just that there are people at the top and they run things, and sometimes, yeah, they show up on the front pages of newspapers, and people made little jokes about Hu Jintao being kind of robotic and not seeming to have much of a personality. There was a little bit more attention given to the premier, Wen Jiabao, who is known as Grandpa Wen because he was somewhat more personable and had more of a, again, this sort of grandfatherly image. But it was very easy to more or less forget about who was in charge. And that's certainly not the case now in a way. I mean, again, the question about cult of personality and Mao, you know, certainly during the Cultural Revolution period, honoring Mao and respecting Mao and placing Mao at the center of everything was really an integral part of Chinese society. And although Xi Jinping is, you know, very centrally positioned now and his image is everywhere, and he's much more of an important figure than Hu Jintao was, or even Jiang Zemin in the early 2000s, we're not back at the point of putting a quote from Xi Jinping's selected writings at the top of every school exam paper or something, which was a common practice during the height of the Mao period, that you always had to put Mao at the center of your life and at the center of your political life. I think it's kind of tricky to say that we're really at a cult of personality now, because I think there's more of an opt-out option than there was during the Mao period. That certainly, you know, you can buy commemorative plates with Xi Jinping's picture on them if you really want them, but you don't have the obligation to own his selected writings in the way that you had to have Mao's Little Red Book. Just anecdotally, I can say when I was in China over the last couple of years and I would have meetings with government officials, they'd be shoving copies of Xi Jinping's Governance of China at us to take for free because they were trying to give them away. Even though you see piles of the book in bookstores, I don't know how many people are actually buying it. There are situations where people have to read this book. They have to sort of pay lip service to the position of Xi Jinping in Chinese society and politics today, but I don't think we're back at a cult of personality. Is the era of collective leadership over? I don't know. I mean, there are jokes about how omnipresent Xi Jinping is in the Chinese government, but there is also a huge state bureaucracy underneath him. And I don't think we can overlook the importance of people who are working in all of the state, the government departments, and keeping the government running. So, yeah.
So it's clearly it's different from a time when who was in charge, what's on second, I don't know, who's on third. Couldn't resist. But
so easy.
But as you said, the society has the government's developed, society has developed, so that there are still these mediating layers, I guess we can call them. But one of the things that I think we in the States are probably extremely concerned about, because we thought it might help change that direction of China going in the future, is civil society and the growth of civil society. When Xi began the anti-corruption campaign, which clearly was needed in terms of restoring some faith and trust in the party, and Uncle Wen turned out to be a billionaire, right. So Grandpa Wen, he wasn't as avuncular as he seemed to be. There were real reasons to sort of clean out the stables and get everything where you could once again talk about being the vanguard of the people. But it also seemed to have translated over into squeezing civil society as well. The NGO laws, which probably you've followed a lot, obviously in terms of media. How far has that gone? Is it as much as we think it has gone here? Is it as significant? Is there no more civil society in China, or is it in its last gasps, and now that he's unfettered from having to step down and at any point in time soon, will Xi Jinping just crush it? What's your sense of where civil society is in China today and going forward?
I think it's a really scary moment, because I think this is one of the things of sort of directionality from the just periodic visits that I've been making to China over the last 30 years. I'd say there was a pattern of, from year to year, there was more space for civil society up until 1989, and then there was the crackdown and the freezing of that. But then from the early 1990s onward, it felt on each visit to China that there was more space. There was more space that the government allowed whatever happened to happen. I was surprised when I got back in the mid-1990s, having not been there since '88, by how much I felt that people would be much more constrained in what they could talk about, and they seemed to be less so. And I was talking about, so what's going on here? And I don't want to quote a taxi driver. That's the most cliched thing you can do. So I'll quote a bartender who said the best thing that I heard. I said, what's going on? How would you describe it? He goes, the attitude now is 没有运动什么都可以. If it's not a movement, anything goes. So the attitude was, you can't organize anything that goes across, that cuts across classes and cuts across locales. If it does that, the party was still haunted by things like Solidarity that had done that in Eastern Europe and caused problems. They were still haunted by Tiananmen that had been a protest we associate with Beijing, but it was in all different cities. It was all different classes. But if you were talking about just organizing a civil society group that was just for one sector of society or just in one locale, that was fine. It was only things that threatened to be a large-scale competing organization that got stomped down very fiercely. That's why Falun Gong became so much in the crosshairs. Not because they were organizing something oppositional necessarily, it was that they were connecting people from all different sectors of society, including within the government, including all over the country. But that sort of pattern of, if it's not a direct challenge, anything goes, is what's starting to disappear. And in retrospect, I think it was starting to disappear from about 2008 on. I think the government began to feel self-confident enough about not having to make these moves toward openness, that there was a tighter control of the press from about that point on. There was a tighter control of various kinds of civil society. There was less ability to just be free of the government, and I think that sped up that process of, now it looks like there was this tightening that began around 2008. And both the Olympics and the success of it and riding out the financial crisis as well as it did led to a kind of self-confidence in the style that the Chinese government was adapting. And then I think, and that has increased. There's less of that space. And yeah, I think that's... Yeah.
So you're predating this, obviously before Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you're implicitly making a claim about the nature of the Chinese government, that our assumptions that modernization, globalization, integration, and the like would lead to liberalization, that once they got confident, and you assume there's some assessment on their part of a level of strength that they had, that the natural inclination was to clamp down, as opposed to, so in Japanese history, the great debate in the 20th century was the war an aberration, so was ultra-nationalism an aberration, or was it a natural development from the Meiji Restoration? And that debate's actually literally never been settled. We're 100 years out beyond that. This is the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration, and people still don't know, was this a quasi-feudal nationalist centralizing restoration, or was it something that was liberalizing but yet get hijacked? It seems to me what you've just said now is that you've sort of swept away the debate about China in a way by saying, once they got confident, the natural inclination was to clamp down. There was not going to be this type of liberalization. So we can't really pin it on Xi Jinping as being a motive changer or direction changer in China. Am I mischaracterizing what you said? Do you think that's right?
Well, I think he's an accelerator of what's going on.
Of that inherent tendency
but I think
was never going to liberalize.
But I think we should also realize that China never follows a course in a vacuum from other things. And you brought in the Meiji Restoration. I love being able to have an excuse to go back in history. The debate in China under the Qing was, in a sense, can we resist? Can we just keep doing what we've always done before, or do we have to kind of have some kind of a wholesale modeling on Western powers? Then Japan brought a new thing into the power. Maybe we can do something that keeps some elements of our tradition very firmly there, like keep an emperor, but do other kinds of things that are much more borrowing from other places and go there. And there has been potential, what else is going on in the world matters. I think the decline of the US as an inspiring model has played a lot to do with undermining the people within China who were arguing for some degree of liberalization. Not a complete Americanization, that was never in the cards. But there was the possibility of saying, well, maybe we should look to some of the other places we admire and do some things like that. The decline of American prestige has accentuated the rise of, I think, strongman rule in many parts of the world, not just China. We've lost a kind of balance.
So if you're
there.
dating this to 2008, you're talking about the Iraq decade. You think that was, and then you also had the financial crisis, where obviously China really felt that, well, we've escaped what you guys fell into, so our model is superior. And then I want to switch to economics to talk to you about some economics. But,
Well,
so
I think
it's not a Trump thing necessarily. It's not a Xi Jinping.
Again, Trump accelerated this. It was an accelerator.
So we have two accelerators.
We have these two accelerators of something that was going on. But I think there are things that happened in the U.S. that undermined admiration for us before this. Government shutdowns. I think if you talk to people in China and in many other places, that seemed to suggest, whichever side was responsible for it here, suggested a kind of inability to just get things done.
But they knew those only lasted like 2 days, right?
I know. But
that's the DC cycle. It's like, the government shut down. 2 days.
Yeah.
But so
lots of problems in the U.S. So the Chinese Communist Party has always wanted to point to the flaws in the American system. It has always tried to say, don't admire too much. But we've been making it really easy for them for quite a while. And it's not just even what happens in D.C. Columbine was a big story in China, the gun violence thing, and the idea that something was out of whack. So these kinds of things fit together. So you just have to think of it in a larger kind of comparative model that you had. So I don't think things were predestined to go this way. I don't think it was foolish to have thought that there was an impetus within China, that there is a strand within China, even within the Chinese Communist Party, for a time that was pushing for more liberalization reform, not full-scale Americanization. That was the fallacy.
Right.
And the fallacy of the end of history, this idea that there was this kind of natural convergence toward a particular kind of liberal democracy, that was a fallacy. But it wasn't a fallacy to imagine that there could have been, that these moves toward a more open China, a more engaged China in the early 2000s could have continued if things had gone a bit differently.
Right.
But you're saying we're already a decade into this reverse course, so to speak, which I think is a very important perspective to have, that it's not just Trump, it's not just Xi Jinping. These are broader, not necessarily impersonal, grand historical Marxist forces, but these are large, long-term movements. I think that's very important, probably for this town to think about, because we always swing back and forth, right? And you see it in some ways in the president's policy. Is it engagement in the greatest trip ever to Beijing and they opened up the Forbidden City, or is it now we're going to slam you on the sanctions, and we're going to put $60 billion worth of sanctions on every year and tariffs and so on and so forth. So these, I think, the longer term vision is very important, which is why, Maura, I wanted to ask you about the economy a little bit. Because let's be honest, for the most part, that's the only reason we've been interested in China for the past 20 years. Now we're worried about security issues, and rightfully so, but it's really the economy. And again, to bring in history, that's why we were interested in Japan back in the 80s and early 90s. It was all about the economy. And once the economy sputtered out, we lost interest. And as someone who started in the Japan field, I watched that process intimately and painfully as people just turned away. Same thing with Russia. Not from the economic side. It was, once the Soviet Union collapsed, we didn't have to pay attention to it. So we've only been paying attention for years to the economy in China. Now we are starting to bring in other elements. But the economy slowed down rather dramatically. It happens to maturing economies. The days of 12%, 10% growth are gone. The new normal, as the Chinese themselves are telling us, is 6% this year, might be 5% in a couple years, 4% in a decade out. Number one, how do we assess what this really means? China is still the world's second or largest economy, depending how you calculate it. It's going to be vitally important for the rest of our lives, but it's not the China that we were thinking about just 10 years ago. So how do we assess what it means? And from a policy-making perspective, what should we be doing to sort of prepare for a different type of Chinese economy than the one we've all bought into for the past 20 years or so?
Right. So, I mean, certainly, as you said, China, even slowing growth in China is still better than growth in many, many other countries around the world. And so a 6%, 5.5%, 5% year-on-year increase is still pretty darn good for a country as big as China is. I think one of the issues that is of most concern to the Chinese Communist Party and is also of great concern to people in China is the disparity in wealth across the country, and the fact that the cities on the East Coast have gotten so wealthy. And so that's why you can read the New York Times and they say, how to spend 36 hours in Shanghai, and it's all about going to high-end restaurants and museums and shopping and so forth. Whereas you can go out into the countryside and things have improved over the past 10 or 15 years. I mean, the economy of the internet and the ability of people to conduct e-commerce online has actually drawn in a lot of people in rural China and improved their standard of living there. But it's still a very, very different situation than it is if you go closer to the East Coast, the eastern seaboard of the country. So I think we are seeing a big shift in the economy. A lot of the manufacturing that the country was so dependent on in the early part of the 21st century is now going out over to other countries that have lower labor costs. And so, what is that going to mean for southern China if it's no longer the workshop of the world? We're seeing a shift to more a government emphasis on entrepreneurship and innovation and investment in tech and things like that China will no longer just be a maker. It will actually design and innovate and create its own thing. So I think in that respect, we're going to see more and more integration between entrepreneurs in China and other parts of the world, because it's not just American manufacturers going over to the country to make cheap clothing or cheap housewares or things like that. Is that people will say, I have this idea for a new piece of tech or something, and I'm going to go to China, I'm going to go to Shenzhen and work with the maker workshops there to design and create a prototype and improve it. It's not just going to be I'm taking my plans and having them execute them. It's that it's going to be much more of a collaboration. So I think we'll probably see a greater integration in that sense of American and Chinese sort of small-scale entrepreneurs in the gig economy, which is a very big thing growing in China that I have to admit I don't know as much about. But certainly, just as it is here, you get more and more people driving for the equivalent of Uber or working in co-working spaces, being even further detached from the Mao-era work units that their parents or grandparents belonged to. Now they're just totally solo entrepreneurs and gig workers. So,
and yet we get, we have reports that the state-owned enterprise sector,
right,
though shrinking numerically, is becoming larger and more significant to the economy as a whole. It controls the commanding heights, right? It controls energy, it controls telecoms, it controls, the large-scale manufacturing. But you're right, Didi, which is the Chinese Uber, which of course successfully maneuvered Uber out of China and is now moving abroad, Tencent and Alibaba. So you do have this very innovative, digitally oriented economy. How do you square the two? How do the Chinese square the two, that the emphasis on continuing to consolidate the state-owned sector and not allow competition and actually not tackle a lot of the inefficiencies is living side by side with the gig economy? Meaning, is a Chinese 23-year-old Didi driver really essentially exactly the same as an American 23-year-old Uber driver? Or because the structures of the economies are different, they're also having to act differently?
Well, I think to your first question about state-owned enterprises or SOEs coexisting with the gig economy, I think the government's argument is actually something like, okay, we need the state-owned enterprise sector to run the country, to take care of the infrastructure, to take care of these really big industries that we're not going to allow competition in because we're in charge. But the state-owned enterprise sector can only absorb so much labor. And they look back to the Mao era and they say, okay, when we were giving everybody jobs in government work units, that was inefficient. And you had people who would get paid to go into an office and just sit there and read the newspaper. And so they say, we need the state-owned enterprise sector, but that can only provide so many jobs. So for everybody else, you should be entrepreneurial and innovative, and you should draw on all of the human capital that we've accumulated over the past 20 years. You should, if you've gone to college, draw on that, and you should work both for yourself and for the country, that it's entrepreneurship and innovation that will make China great again in that sense. That we need that sort of rush of innovation and energy to come up from the bottom to carry that sector of the economy along. But for the very big, again, like the state-owned enterprises, I think the idea is that it's safer to have the state run things like infrastructure, energy, and so forth, that you want stability at the top for those sorts of industries.
Jeff, let me ask you about this innovation question. Yeah. If you read, you mentioned The End of History, one of Francis Fukuyama's books. Another book that he wrote, though, was called Social Capital. I forget I'm just blanking. Anybody remember the exact title? I think it's Social Capital. It's a great book, but I'm forgetting the title right now. But his point was, why is the West different from a lot of other places? Is because we have social capital, meaning innovation is encouraged, risk-taking is encouraged, entrepreneurship is supported, there's social bonds of trust. Maybe it's called social trust. Somebody better Google it while we're talking so I don't feel completely awful. You have transparency in law, you have transparency in finances, you have transparency in banking, and that encourages risk-taking. It's why you can have the types of economies we have, and there are times, obviously, where government gets heavily involved. This is what we're hearing now about China. There's the Made in China 2025 initiative, which is to have China as a leading developer and manufacturer, as Maura was indicating, of top technologies from AI, artificial intelligence, to robotics, to aeronautics and medical technologies and the like by 2025. There is all this talk now, right, about the innovation sector in China. Now we're really beginning to pay attention to AI. There was a new report that was just released from Oxford just a few days ago on AI, the AI challenge. Number one, I guess I'd ask is, how real do you think it all is? But number two, how can you ask for innovation in a increasingly repressive, stultifying, autocratic, non-democratic society, or do we not understand what causes innovation?
So I think there are a couple of different things to keep in mind. One is that there's always been a lot of creativity within China, and business. I mean, you can look at the long history. China is often thought of as like resistant to experimentation, but there's been plenty of experimentation, and the Communist Party itself has experimented with things, and the Communist Party is a very diagnostic organization. It looks at what's brought what's happened in other places, and if it wants to avoid that fate, it tries to alter the equation. So it's trying very self-consciously to encourage innovation in things. But there is a contradiction there of wanting to have control. And one of the ways that you see that contradiction played out most is the treatment of Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is a place where many of these kinds of rule of law was quite strong. Even when there was limited democracy, there were separate courts, there were a variety of things that made it a conducive place for just the kind of innovation that Beijing now claims to want to bring into the country. And yet, Beijing has been trying to squeeze it. It had universities that were much more like universities in other parts of the world in terms of encouraging freedom of debate and things like that, and that is tightening. And that can be seen, so this is the tension within the party of both wanting to create the space for this creativity and innovation, but also squeezing the very place that was going on because of the desire for control. We can also see that with there's a lot of talk about how China would like to increase its soft power, would like to have art that's admired around the world, entertainments that are admired around the world. Well, Hong Kong was the great soft power success story in a sense, not in the sense of Hong Kong movies were the ones that were influencing Hollywood, that Hollywood directors would remake films that were made in Hong Kong, with The Departed was based on a Hong Kong film. Hollywood will remake films that are popular in South Korea and popular in Japan. They've never remade a mainland movie, at least so far, which suggests that one of the ways that I think the Communist Party, as careful and diagnostic as it is, what it didn't take from that was to say, well, as some of us were hoping, well, maybe the mainland should start trying to do some things that make mainland cities a bit more like Hong Kong. And initially, after 1997, it seemed that that was happening. Shenzhen, which is one of the centers of this maker economy, was near Hong Kong, and it seemed to be that some patterns of Hong Kong media, Hong Kong culture was flowing over the border in that direction. But in the last few years, rather than mainland cities becoming a bit more like Hong Kong in some ways, which happened in certain regards, Hong Kong is being made to be more like mainland ones. So you definitely have this incredible contradiction here. I would just say, to connect these two parts of the discussion, the sort of moves on the political front and moves on the economic front, there is a connection between them, and it can be a worrisome one too. So with the declining growth rates, one of the stories that the Communist Party was saying was, only under our watch does the economy keep booming and booming and booming. That story starts to have less purchase. So you need to think of other stories that have purchase. And what are the stories that the Communist Party has told to legitimate itself over the years? One story was, before we came into power, Chinese officials were corrupt. Then we came around and they stopped being corrupt. Well, people don't believe that anymore. They used to say, before we came into power, there were wide divides between wealth and poverty. Well, people don't believe that anymore. So what stories are left? And the stories that's left is, until we came into power, China was disrespected by the world, did not have the clout it had. There'd been a century when that story can still work. So they're kind of doubling down on that. So a rise of nationalism. So a decline of the economic story of growth can lead to needing other things to fill its place. Charismatic authority can be one thing that can reconnect with people. Nationalism is another one. So Xi Jinping is also starting to talk a tougher story about nationalism and the expansion in the South China Seas. These are not unrelated to the economic story. Sort of as long as you could point to people and say, of course we should be in charge. Look at how the economy is booming and booming and booming. If you've been left behind by the economic boom, your turn will come next. Right. If some people are starting to think, well, I missed out on my turn, so maybe I'll never get it, you need to have something else to shift their attention to. And I think that's why we're already seeing some worrying effects in part of the slowing economy, which is a resurgence of kind of official nationalism, push in that direction, and perhaps that push toward charismatic authority. The one thing that Maura said about the limiting, we aren't back in the Mao period completely, we really just don't know. Does anybody get personally excited? Some people do. We saw them crying when with joy when Xi Jinping was put on for another period. But we don't really know yet if there are kind of true believers and how deep it goes. But perhaps that effort to try to get people to believe in something is part of what's there.
But even can you, the 50s, 60s, 70s, in an era where people weren't on, Weibo and they weren't, they weren't connected to the world,
right,
even as with the restrictions the way they are today, and they couldn't talk with each other. Before we get to questions, though, Maura, I wanted to ask you, Jeff has brought up foreign policy. Obviously, that's, prime concern just, across the street here.
Right.
How do you rate Xi Jinping's foreign policy so far?
That's an excellent question. I think, he's certainly positioning himself as the person to lead China take a stronger and more assertive stance on the world stage, that the U.S. is kind of stepping back from global leadership and China is ready to step up. So he gave a speech last January at the Davos World Economic Forum to say, the People's Republic of China believes in globalization and we want to help promote it throughout the world, which is certainly, a huge change from China 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I think certainly from the public's perspective, he's doing a great job, the Chinese public's perspective, that is. He's doing a great job in foreign policy. He's had some very successful overseas trips. He had Donald Trump come to China and then praise the trip as one of the best ever. So I think from the perspective of someone steering China into a different position, a new era, as he's putting it, onto the global stage. He's doing it very, very carefully, very soundly from the perspective of the Chinese public. U.S.-China relations and U.S. policy toward China is a much trickier subject to tackle right now because there's a lot that we don't know. And there are, certainly many conflicts in the U.S.-China relationship, which some of them have been in existence for years. So the question of Taiwan's status, for example, that's a sort of recurring little issue that can bubble up whenever there's friction in the U.S.-China relationship. But for the most part, since the 90s until just a couple of years ago, things were pretty much status quo, that there would be the occasional little bump and little dispute, but things were moving along a very, very carefully constructed, very carefully cultivated diplomatic relationship. I think that's becoming a little less certain now, although back when Donald Trump was elected, there was a rush of commentary right after the election saying, what does this mean for U.S.-China relations? He's going to rewrite the rules, that China had played such a large role in Trump's campaign rhetoric that people thought that from the day he came into office, he would try to rewrite the U.S.-China relationship. And we haven't really seen that. He has continued to use China at times as a demon, but at other times he's praised the country. And so it's much less certain, but I think overall things have moved on a smoother course than anyone anticipated, 16 months ago. When he was first elected.
If we do, since being in D.C., and I rarely get to think I can give advice to anybody listening, but there's one bit of foreign policy advice I would like to give, which is just that I think we should retire this old kind of Orientalist notion that China is a culture that cares so much about face that when you deal with a figure like Xi Jinping, you should be incredibly praiseful and deferential, even if you're then making hard calls. It's actually, we should be aware of how things like him getting to ride in a golden carriage in England and being praised on his quote unquote re-election, how this can play within the country to contribute to exactly the kind of authoritarian personality, charisma idea that he's trying to build. And there just should be a way of saying, we need to deal with China, we need to deal with it, but we don't need to be fawning. We don't need to fall over ourselves in ways that, Mark Zuckerberg did, holding up a copy of his book and saying, this is such a...
One of the best things I've ever read.
Yeah, do this. Yeah, and actually, Maura told me about this. If you go to the online reviews at Amazon.com of Xi Jinping's governance of China, there are all these things by foreigners talking about what a brilliant work it is. And it's quite boring. I mean, it's a compilation of speeches that goes over and over. There's an element of some of the things that he does that play so well in an international arena is he'll go to a different country and he'll say, I've read your great authors, and then he'll list like a dozen authors, quite scattershot. I mean, people that anybody who really reads won't equally like each of these authors. But it's sort of like anybody that's respected in your country, I'm going to show respect to. And then that fits in with this own kind of like eclectic. Anything that's considered great from the Chinese past, I'll connect with. Mao was great, so was Confucius. Well, there's a problem there. Mao hated Confucius, and thought it was backward. But I think this idea of moving toward a way of dealing with China in a very kind of clear-headed and non-hyperbolic way of just sort of, and including in the symbolism of it. And so I think this idea of, these countries that supposedly are so obsessed with face, I mean, if clearly Trump is incredibly obsessed with face, and we don't say this is a fundamental feature of American culture is you have to, when you treat, no, this is something that you want to keep in check. And I think that's part of the mystification of China that keeps coming up.
It's a good, it's good advice, but I particularly like this point about the mystification of China, which we seem to do with Asia. We continue to do it. I don't think we really do it with almost any other part of the world still, and it's as a historian, to me it's shocking we still do this in the 21st century. I think we still mystify Japan in a lot of ways.
And the Japan, since you mentioned, I was starting my graduate work in the early 80s, and I thought there were no jobs for history PhDs, which is true then and true now. So I thought I'd better have a plan B. So I thought, I'll do Chinese history. I liked European history, but what would somebody with a PhD in English history do? So I'm studying China, and I would tell people, because, if I can't get a job teaching history, which I want to do, I'm studying China. It's, an important country and all that. People said, you're half smart. They said, because if you were really smart, you would be studying Japan, because that's the country that's going to, eat our lunch economically. Or you should study Russia, because that's the country that's the big geopolitical rival. So now my wife likes to say that I get the last laugh, because China now is Japan then plus Russia. But a lot of the mystification about Japan at that time was the same. We should study, there was no one Japanese leader whose work you were, but oh, look, Japan's really got its act together. Those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No question. We want to get to audience questions. I know you guys have lots of questions. In fact, this is such a popular topic that we even have a member of the audience who can't speak yet who is here sleeping right now. There's a ton of interest, so we want to make sure that we get as many questions in as we can. We have a couple of mics. Please just briefly ask the question. Let us know who you are, but try to keep it pointed so we can get as many in as possible. We'll start in the back here.
Thank you so much. My name is Nicolas Romero. I really appreciate your discussion today. My question is, and it's based kind of on a recently published Michael Swain piece at Carnegie. Is China a revisionist power in the way that the new national security strategy and the national defense strategies recently released late last year and early this year, the U.S. national security strategy and national defense strategy, say, or is it not? And Swain uses the point that there's very little empirical evidence to suggest that China is pursuing this revisionist pathway. And it's very difficult, I think, for observers of China to parse through all of the speeches by the senior leaders of China, because they use euphemism and doublespeak, and they harken back to allegory that may be obscure to a lot of Americans. So how do you suggest we view China? Is it revisionist? And then what sort of pointers would you suggest for somebody who's perhaps off the street and trying to go through these things themselves and analyze developments in China?
Do you mean by revisionist, do you mean that it will try to change the rules of the international order, revise?
Yes.
Okay. I'll jump in.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, but you can go first.
I would just say, look, we shouldn't think of the mistake has periodically to think in all or nothing terms. It was either China was going to collapse or China was going to democratize, when a lot of people were arguing, well, it's not going to do either of those things, and don't think in those. And in this terms, it was, you had the books that have these thesis-thumping titles that get a lot of attention but often overstate things. There was Playing Our Game, a book that was said, look, China will be integrated into the global order without being, it will be altered to fit into the global order. And then others, when China rules the world, that would say, no, actually be ready for Pax Sinica or whatever. The reality is that there's a degree of adaptation. A rising power is, even one as determined and going its own way as China might be, is going to make adjustments to fit into the extant status quo, and it's going to alter the extant status quo. And to think of it in these all or nothing terms, it's not the way to think of it as either or. We saw this with the Olympics, where it was the Olympics will change China. How will the Olympics change China? Look at what happened in Seoul. Democracy came after they opened it. My friend Susan Brownell was saying at the time, shouldn't we also be asking, how will China change the Olympics? And in fact, that was the right question to ask too. The Olympics, the sort of expectation for a kind of spectacle at a very high level was something that altered it. But it's not as though the Olympics stopped being what the Olympics were before completely. You have both an impact and some elements of the previous order going. Things are very, very different than it was when the United States was the rising power. But the United States clearly altered some things about the international order and adapted itself to some aspects of it. And it's a more worrisome thing with China, but we should expect some things to happen at both sides, I'd say.
Yeah. So I just wanted to follow up when you were asking about what are the sort of practical things, or what's the knowledge that someone should have when they enter into trying to analyze the Chinese foreign policy or the US-China relationship. And I think, not to sound like too much of a historian, but you should know the importance of history, and especially the importance of history to the Chinese government and to Chinese foreign policy. And so, there has been this very, very intense patriotic education movement in China since the early 1990s that has taught school children about what's called the century of humiliation from the 1840s through the 1940s, when the country was defeated by foreign powers, when there were what China considers unequal treaties imposed on it by those foreign Western powers, plus Japan. And there were zones of extraterritoriality within the country. And so everything in Chinese foreign policy under the Chinese Communist Party over the past 60 years has been about overcoming the century of humiliation. And so I think it's very important not just to look at it from the perspective of how does China compare to a rising United States in the late 19th century, but also what is the strand of Chinese history that plays into the rhetoric and into the foreign policy, and why is that important? Why should we know about this? How does that inform the leadership's decisions and the choices that they make about how to go out into the world and how to assert China's place in the world? And I think that understanding of that history and the century of humiliation in particular is very important, because it is, when you're in the country and when you're studying history in China, such a emphasized part of the past.
And I'd say a great book to read to look at this. Howard French has a new book, Everything Under Heaven.
Yeah.
It's a really good, and it's just out in paperback with a new preface.
Hi, my name is Lad Veit. I'm from the Victims of Communism Foundation. So my question is for Dr. Cunningham regarding the cult of personality. At what point do you think we can start talking of China as a cult of personality around Xi? What's the threshold there? Thank you.
Well, I think it's hard to determine a threshold, but I do think it's important, like I said earlier, that people can sort of opt out. You don't have the sort of peer pressure to participate in large celebrations of the leader, as was the case under Mao, when there were rallies in Tiananmen Square and people were performing dances and things like that. So right now, I do think, Jeff raised the question of how much do people really buy into this? How much is it that the government's putting stuff out there, and how much do average citizens actually partake of it and promote it themselves? And the state media will always bring to the surface stories of this person who has photographs of Xi Jinping in their living room, and he's memorized Xi's entire governance of China, all the speeches in the governance of China or something. And okay, that may be one person. That story may not really be true. That may be one person. But do we have a sort of large scale up from the bottom? Or is the government forcing people to participate in a cult of personality? And right now, I don't think, if that's a threshold, we're certainly not at it yet. We are seeing the government put a lot of stuff out there, but I don't necessarily think that we're seeing people buying it.
My name's Dennis Stevens. When I was in college in 1981, I spent a week at Cambridge in England, and they were selling T-shirts, the Young Conservatives, that said, "Visit Russia before Russia visits you." And as you all were talking today, it made me think about all the articles I read about China just all over Africa, all over Latin America, Central America, obviously Asia, in our universities in America. And I just thought I should probably ask, where is it that they're not extending their power and influence?
So, yeah, I mean, there's actual history and then uses of history. So this Belt and Road Initiative, which initially thought like recapture the glory of the Silk Road. The Silk Road was something that connected China to certain other places, basically along a land route. It was actually a place where a lot of influence flowed in both directions. It wasn't just a hierarchical thing from China, and there were a lot of influences into China. But it's now being reimagined as something that largely is Beijing flowing out, and it's both a belt and a road, and confusingly, the Silk Road is the belt, and the road is over, anyway. But it now includes all kinds of places that were not part of any historic Silk Road. And of course, it's being described by Beijing as a win-win situation. Everybody gets something, but it also is seen as a unidirectional thing out. So there's almost no place that's unrelated to the story of China. But I think it's that we need to be careful about, even though there's a very strong state, even though there's more of an authoritarian, harder form of authoritarianism within China, we need to guard against this image of a kind of going back into things that are like Yellow Peril, visions of kind of automatons who are doing the bidding of Beijing everywhere. There are all kinds of different experiences of Chinese students within foreign countries. We had this romanticized fantasy that once somebody studied in America, they would go back and we actually imagined it as kind of secret agents for change within there, and that would transform China. And now the danger is to have the opposite idea, that say, well, actually, look at these insidious agents for change within here. It's more complicated, and people come to the United States and are both radically altered by their experience in universities here, or come across enough experiences of sort of casual racism or other things that then leads them back in China to be more nationalistic than they were, than they left, thinking, oh, well, actually, the government was right. So I think we need to be careful at not having an overreaction that actually helps the Chinese government in its particular propaganda now, and realize these are very complicated stories. And even the story of China, young people in China are both much more in step with young people in many parts of the world in terms of the popular culture. They're exposed to the things they're doing much more so than in the Mao era and other, when China was on a very completely separate trajectory. But it is also worrisome because there is that extension of a China with the Chinese government with an agenda. So to balance both those things and avoid falling into the trap of demonizing every effort by China abroad, but also having clear eyes and realizing that going to an American university doesn't mean you're instantly convinced of the superiority of liberal democratic values.
Tom Timberg, consultant. I wondered if you'd explore the extent to which we may be dealing with a cyclical phenomenon for authoritarian governments. This struck me because the last time I was here was to hear Kotkin talking about Stalin's consolidation after the NEP. And again, as with even Stalin, because of the contradictions, you often meet difficulties, the Nazi invasion, whatever, and then you liberalize for a period, and then you go back, and after enough cycles of these, perhaps you get transformed.
Well, I think that was the assumption. And actually, if someone digs up a copy of the second edition of our book and they go back and read that was, I think, sort of the assumption that we were working on at that point, that in late 2012, yes, there was a tightening atmosphere, but there had been a major corruption scandal at the top of the government. A new leader was coming into power. And so there was this idea that things were tightening up on a very and it was just part of the cycle, that this was what the Chinese government did and the Chinese Communist Party did when there was a change in power. But after Xi Jinping got comfortably seated at the top, then things would loosen up a little. And I would say when you read the third edition, that's no longer our perspective. That's if it is a cycle, it's extended much longer than we anticipated, and it's also being influenced, like Jeff said, by things that are happening in other parts of the world. And we do see this more authoritarian, more strongman leadership coming in other countries, in Russia, Modi in India, plenty of other places. And so I don't know if we can say that the cycle has been broken, or if it's just stretching out a little bit longer than we anticipated, or if we're going to see a total shift. Maybe if we write a fourth edition of the book, we'll be able to analyze that better.
And I think it is true that there have been a couple of good pieces by other people who are trying to move between scholarship and the public sphere. Julian Gewirtz wrote one for China File saying, we're so obsessing on Xi Jinping, we should not assume that this is the end of Chinese history. We shouldn't have an end of history idea with that. We should keep that in mind. And Denise Ho at Yale wrote a piece of thinking about China's political DNA, if you will, as having a double helix, like the DNA, with a kind of reform-minded strand, open-minded strand, and a closing off authoritarian one, and always being aware that when one is in the ascendant, there's some kind of existence of the other. And history comes in differing ways. One of the historical moments to look back to now in China, their 120-year, 60-year cycles are like centuries in the Western recounting sometimes, and 120-year periods are like bicentennials. So it's worth thinking about 120 years ago, there was a reform movement in China that seemed as though it was going to move China toward sort of constitutional monarchy, and then there was a crackdown on that and an end of reform. And it seemed as though reformers went into exile, and the way in which some of that kind of spirit of change stayed alive was people like Sun Yat-sen in the West and Liang Qichao in Japan. And it seemed that on the mainland, that kind of reform had been foreclosed. Then in 1900, the Boxer crisis, a foreign invasion, suddenly the dynasty decides the only way we'll survive is to reform. So too little, too late, they introduce constitutional reforms and are overthrown. So it also is important to remember that, what happens in a broader part of the world will alter that. So it is also, we're in a global period of authoritarianism that we definitely hope, at least I do, is cyclical.
Thank you. Jack Goldstone from George Mason University. Thanks for this presentation. I want to raise for you a perhaps more extreme version of your fourth edition to be. I think things really have changed in China, and that we tend to look at China as entering our world. Mm-hmm. That is, the 19th century, the strongest states in the world were constitutional free market states. That was challenged by communism. Communism lost, and again, free market constitutional states. So we tend to think, are they going to move toward that slow, fast, you can't have free markets without, or you can't have technology and science without freedom? They don't accept any of that. Right. And China is now, I believe, trying to respond to the century of humiliation with a century of restoring its proper place in the world. Mm-hmm. They don't care about the US. That's fine. We can do whatever we want here. But to have American missiles in Korea, in Japan, for Japan and Korea to look to America and not to China for leadership is an abomination of the natural order for them, I believe, is how they're looking at it now. They haven't had the strength to do anything about that before. Mm-hmm. But now I think they feel confident, and they see disarray in Europe. They see a president in the US who only cares about trade and is easy to flatter. So I think at least for the next 20 years, before the demographic crisis hits, while they're still in 5, 6, 7% growth mode, we're going to have to work with a China that is trying to restore a much stronger global role for itself, and especially in East Asia is not going to want to accept a dominant US position. Do you think that's true, and what will it mean for our policy relations?
Yes, I absolutely believe that's true. and I think you articulated probably better than I did something that I was trying to get across earlier, which is that, we being Americans for the last probably 30 years have been thinking this is a process of China becoming more like us, the Chinese becoming more like us. And I think that's been very thoroughly disproven, this whole end of history thing. That's not going to be the case. And I do think that we need to understand China better on its own terms rather than just how it relates to a teleological path that we think we've determined for it. And so, yes, I think that understanding the direction that the Chinese leadership wants to take the country in, and that it's not going to mirror anything that's happened in the United States or other Western liberal democracies over the decades, that's very important. And I think understanding China's, the desire of China to take a leadership role in regional power dynamics is very important. That, I don't totally agree with you when you say that they don't care what happens in the United States, because I think the country's leadership does look at the United States just in terms of as a reference point, and they want to see what's going on over here. And yes, they do play up school shootings, which unfortunately I've been there's been something catching my eye on the TV that it looks like there was one. And so that is always headline news in China, because people say, how does this happen? How do people bring guns into schools in the United States? And I was there when the Virginia Tech shooting happened 10 years ago. And I mean, we spent days talking about it.
What it's worth, I have students that I meet in China who say, I'd love to come study in the United States, but my parents won't let me.
Yeah, everyone has guns. Yeah, I got that all the time. And yes, that's a very common thing. So I think that what happens in the United States is important, because then the Chinese Communist Party can point to some of these things and say, we don't have these same problems here. We might have problems, but they're very different ones. So I do think that it's important to understand, like I said, understand China on its own terms, and that's why we try to encourage people to read the state media, not necessarily to believe what it says, but to understand the narratives that the government is putting forth, and to figure out, what does this mean, what does this imply for the direction that they're trying to take the country in.
And as a couple very specific examples of how the historical legacy can inflect current events. In 1990, after the June 4th massacre of '89, there were 7 countries that were talking about joint economic moves against China. Deng Xiaoping gave a speech where he said, I know history. I'm Chinese and I know history. When a group of foreign powers starts banding together against China, I think of 1900. That was when there was an invasion of China after the Boxer Uprising. It would seem a total disconnect for that. It was, but that was a moment in that. And when in 1999, when NATO bombs hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and I was hanging out watching the anti-American protests with some very smart journalists, it was very interesting to see a disconnect here. That USA Today, some of the protests took place outside of the American embassy, and USA Today wrote, things don't seem to have changed since the Boxer Rebellion. Look, they're wildly xenophobic. And look, nobody was being killed. It was actually, there was the first strike had been against Chinese lives. Nobody wants to have people in an embassy die. It was partly an upsurge. But the Chinese press at the same time looked back to 1900 and said, look, nothing ever changes in the Western world. A group of foreign powers are interfering with the sovereignty of a foreign country, and Chinese people are dying. So these very weird half-lives of historical reference points, which we certainly, China has no monopoly on this. We see how the Civil War still has these very strange half-lives. In Japan, things have these very strange half-lives. But these are kinds of things. So it's a reason, if we're going to take a world where China is large and important as it is, we need to know something about its past and how that past is understood.
Sean Todd, consultant. Really have enjoyed the discussion and dialogue. Outstanding. Question about energy policy and climate change inside China. My client was building 10 years ago 5 AP1000 Westinghouse reactors. Nuclear sectors continue to expand in China, lots of coal deposits. But I just read in your book, largest importer of oil in the world. Does the Chinese government take climate change seriously? Is that debate happening inside that country like this country? One side saying it's hoax, the other saying there's man-made climate change. Just curious what the Chinese attitude is.
Mike Downey, retired military. What would your best recommendation be to Western democratic leaders on how to cope with the rising Chinese expansion, both politically and economically? And as a subset of that, not to put you on the spot, if you were Trump's advisor on tariffs, how would you recommend, and what would the Chinese reaction be?
Which one do you want to take? I'll take the climate change one.
Darn, that was mine.
So the cover of the new book is green. The first one was orange, and we thought it was great to avoid the color red on every China book. But the second edition was red. We gave in. But we were giving a talk on the second edition in University of Nottingham, and Ningbo has a branch campus. And we said, if we do a third edition, what should it be like? And a young Chinese student in the audience said, you should make the cover green, because the issue that will really matter in China is the environment. And I think it's not so much about the debate on climate change, but the Chinese government realizes that the story it's been telling people is that under our watch, life gets better. You're living much better than your parents and grandparents did. With growth rates slowing, the economic side of that is a little more problematic, but increasingly there's the idea, is being able to buy more stuff having a better life? So I think the Chinese Communist Party takes the pollution problem very, very seriously. And to some extent, that means accepting the broader story about climate change rather than that. But on the other hand, there's lots of other stories that it also cares about, like continuing to expand its influence in other places. So what it's done, somewhat hypocritically, but not uniquely, is try to do certain kinds of things to control pollution and encourage green technologies within the country to try to get some of this under control, while at the same time doing infrastructure projects on the Belt and Road in which it seems they could care less about the environmental costs. So it's again a kind of selective thing, as I think a lot of governments do with these.
Maura, you can get the last word.
The last word. And your question was about the U.S., how should we deal with a rising China?
Not just the U.S., but
But
the
the
Western
Western-
democratic leaders,
right.
how to best cope with the Chinese expansion, and a subset of that, Trump and the tariffs.
Yeah, tariffs. I think it's important not to pick apart your language, but the notion of how do we cope with a rising China. And I think we need to not take for granted the assumption that this is a threat, that it's a danger, that it's something to fight against. In China for a long time, there's been rhetoric when Barack Obama was president about the U.S. trying to contain China, that whatever China did, the U.S. felt threatened by it and the country was trying to prevent it, or that we were trying to block Chinese actions. I think we certainly need to be attentive. And just like Jeff said in response to an earlier question, China going out into universities or into different sectors of the economy, this expansion of China in many, many different facets of life, is something we should be watchful of. But I don't think we should at all start from a premise that it's a threat or a danger or that it is going to undermine liberal Western democracy. So I do think that we need smart people in the government. We need people who have real language experience, people who have who have spent time in the country and who really understand it. But I don't think that we necessarily need to react to every single thing that the Chinese government does throughout the world. I think we need to be watchful at this moment in time and keep an eye on what's going on and be aware of the opportunities that there are for China to undermine things that are happening in other countries, but not to always be reactive or on the offensive to things like that. As for your question about tariffs, that's not my forte. There is a book in this series called China's Economy, What Everyone Needs to Know. We were not asked to write it for a very good reason.
We'll do that one next.
Yeah, so I think you should ask people more skilled than we are.
Well, there's obviously a ton more that we could be talking about, and we will be talking about when the 4th edition comes out. We'll come right back here and do it again. But please join me in thanking Jeff and Maura.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you.